Right, I'm at the crucial stage now where we're beginning to build the initial or final falls into the pond. And for me, it's always these kind of edging stones here and this section, which is about the most important part of the cascade. This is going to sort of define whether the water pours over the stone or under the stones, or if you have any issues with water flowing where it shouldn't do, up behind the edging stones over here. So there's a couple of things you can do, some little tips, which make this an awful lot easier to do. Now, I've been very fortunate here in that this is all one piece of liner. So the main pond liner and the transition into the cascade is all one piece. There's no overlaps and there's no joins, etc. So that, first of all, is great for a bit of peace of mind. Although it's not a problem having two pieces of liner, it does make it slightly more taxing, having to make sure that you've got enough of an overlap with the original liner and then enough of an overlap with the new liner sort of flapping over to prevent any potential leaks. So this is a bonus that I've got a big enough pond liner to do this. But there's a couple of very important creases, very simple but often overlooked, which will make a huge difference in ensuring that water flows over the spill stone and not underneath it or around it, and to ensure that we can deflect as much water as possible from the edging stones. We don't want anything percolating down behind these stones and sort of entering the pond elsewhere. We want to be able to control all the water coming over this spill stone. So these folds are very important. If I suddenly shout out an obscenity, it's because I've dropped my microphone in the pond, so bear with me. Here we go. So this is the first fold or pleat I'm talking about, and I have just gathered up, pulled the liner up to create this fold, and I shall be laying this up tight against the edge of the spill stone, and then putting rocks just slightly lower than the top of the spill, like this, cemented into place to conceal all of this. And this is important for two reasons. One, we can deflect all the water over this spill, but two, we can also ensure that this pool is going to retain water and it's not all going to drain and percolate back down into the pond when the system is switched off. If you've got a large cascade and a series of big pools, if they don't retain water, when you go to switch on the pond pump, it takes an awful lot of your pond water to fill up these falls before it cascades over and ends up back into the pond. And if you've got quite a small volume of water in the pond and quite a large cascade, you can end up dropping the levels of your pond quite considerably before you end up with that fall. So making sure that these chambers can hold water means that you're using minimal water from your pond to fill it up to the stage of overflow. So that's really important. So we've got a fold here, and I'm continuing that fold, that crease, if you can see here, up behind this stone. And I want to make sure that my next big rock placement holds that into position, like so. So as the water is falling down the cascade, it physically can't go past this piece of liner. This is a barrier deflecting all the water in this direction. And of course, as a final sort of belt and braces and bit of peace of mind, the pond liner itself, of course, comes up behind all these stones and is overlapped up here. But this crease, very important, all the way around and up here as well. And it's going to be sandwiched between, here we go, these two stones here as well. Probably makes no sense whatsoever, and it just looks like a mess of creases and folds, but that's very important. So this morning, I get to give the lowest section of the cascade its first wet test. So that was built up yesterday, and the cement has had overnight to harden off, and it's fine now just to run some water over it. And this gives me an idea at the early stages, before I get too committed to the falls, how the water's going to pour over it and how it's going to look. So I'm very pleased with that. That falls over that stone nicely. It's very difficult to try to get a spill stone levelled correctly, particularly if the stone itself have got lots of riven surfaces. You need to try to anticipate how the water's going to flow and what it's going to do when it hits those lumps and bumps. But that fills that stone nice and evenly. And will create a good sound. So I can work my way now today for the rest of the cascade. You can see the second spill stone is in place, and indeed the third spill stone behind it, which is a much chunkier, blockier piece. And I need to now work up, continuing with the edging stones as I go. Well, when you're building cascades, it's not an exact science. And sometimes you'll lay a few stones and then you won't like it and you'll rip it up and you'll do it again. And I'm happy with how these stones have been forming and the shape it's taking. But I've discovered a couple of rocks now that I prefer the look of and I think might work in certain areas. This area at the back here has been troubling me a little bit, and I've sort of got away with using smaller stones, but I'm coming away and looking at the larger stones I'm using and the bigger stones on the original cascade, and it just doesn't seem in theme, in keeping with the remainder of the cascade. And I know that once it's brushed up and the cement's gone and it's planted up, it will be easy to disguise that. But I want to be happy with it, and I want it to tie in with everything else. So I've got this stone here which has got a lovely sort of recess, a nice overhang here, and I reckon that might well work over here in lieu of those smaller stones. Might not. Might be taking a gamble and rip it all up for nothing, but you've got to try these things until you're happy with it. Right, so having partially built up the cascade this morning, then discovering some more rocks that I preferred the look of, and ripping out all of the older stone, I'm much happier with how this has panned out. So another little tip when you're building cascades and you're using stonework and you're mortaring the rock together rather than using foam is that you're going to use an awful lot of mortar when you're doing this, and there'll be a lot of muck and cement visible in the gaps, and you can try and plug these up as much as possible with small stones and bits and pieces. But you need to be a little bit kind of aware of, once the cascade is running and the stonework is wet and some of this mortar is in contact with water, it's very, very quickly going to develop kind of a patina of natural algae and discoloration, which is going to make any of this stuff here looking, look very natural. So don't be too concerned about trying to conceal some of this. But a good tip when you're doing this, I'll try and do this one-handed. Now a good tip when you're doing this, just to try to tidy up and remove all of these bits and pieces, is to scrape away and then to use a brush with some water. Now only do this once the mortar has had a couple of hours to sort of semi-harden, and once it's at the stage where it's beginning to go off and it's just becoming sort of touch dry, you can then start to scrape away and brush over it with a coarse brush or a paintbrush and some water, and that will rinse away some of the finer particles and the top layer of sort of cement, revealing more of the rough kind of sharp sand and gritty bits that make the whole look a lot more natural. So I'm just using my little pointing tool here and just scraping away some of the dry visible mortar and just smoothing it back in. And once I've got the bulk of it off, using a couple of different paint brushes and dipping them in water and trying not to flick all of this onto the lens of the camera, just washing away the top layer of the stone and washing away some of that visible cement. And as I say, don't do this until the mortar has had a couple of hours to start to go off. There we go. Now in doing this, you're going to of course stain the remainder of the rocks in a very light cementy sort of slurry, but don't worry, it's a very, very weak, lean kind of stain, a lean mix of cement, and that will wash off very, very easily with a jet wash. Here we go. So you can see now the effect of just washing that away. And I'm going to go around and do that on all of the stones that I've laid today. It's another blisteringly hot morning today. I think today's going to be set to be the hottest day of the year so far, 29 degrees, and yet another day of wearing chest waders. So I shall definitely make the most of that and try and cool off in the pond now and again. But the bulk of the cascade has been constructed. I've just given it a little wet test this morning to see how the 3 spills work, and the water falls over those nicely, so that's great. So I've got a little bit more construction to do to just complete that back section of walling over there, and then to render into place the final stones. And what we've opted for here is we've got a great big rock sitting on top here, which has got some hollows underneath, and the idea is that the water is just going to naturally percolate out from underneath that rock, giving the appearance of kind of a natural spring feeding the top of the original falls and the top of this falls, and then cascading down back into the pond. Now, to feed water to the top of this cascade, obviously we're using some quite large bore 1.5 inch heavy duty hosing here. And one could just simply sort of drop the hose in over the top and cement it in place, but it's quite difficult to conceal the pipework and to get it low enough down below ground level for it to be concealed, without that then causing issues with not having enough of a margin between the surface of the water in here and the top of the pond liner, because we want to have a good clearance of a few inches. So what I'm going to do here is to add a tank connector, a through liner connector, below ground, where I'll be cutting a hole in the side of the pond liner here, and then using this Awaza Tradux or Tradux hose union, which will go through the pond liner, clamp into place. It's got a nice big flat washer here, but I'm going to glue it as well for additional security. And then we can attach a hose tail onto the end of this, and we can secure our pipework here so that water enters well below ground level and the pipework is going to be completely concealed and not visible at all. It's quite a daunting prospect initially doing something like this. You've got to obviously cut a hole in the pond liner. It's never nice doing that, but it's easy enough to do. And with this particular unit, there we go, we've got a 2-inch hole to cut. And if you're slightly bigger, or it's not, you know, a perfectly circular cut, as long as it's big enough to get this end through, but smaller than the 3-inch or 3.5 inch, maybe even 4-inch actually, sort of plate here which the lock nut clamps onto, you're going to be able to get a nice join and a nice seal on that. For the additional security, I'm just using a little bit of pond sealant. Normally I would use wet water sticky stuff, but it's only available in quite large containers, and I'm only going to use a small amount for this. So instead I've got a gold label, what's called a one shot. It's a pressurized container, which doesn't require a glue gun. You've got your own little lever on here, and you can just pull the trigger, and under pressure the glue will come out. So that's a bit cheaper, and it means that I can just use this as a throwaway unit, use what I require, and that's that done. Now the way I'm going to cut the hole for this tank connector is to lay this down on the ground here and to stretch the pond liner nice and tight over the top of the connector so that you can see the obvious impression there of the pipework. And then I'm going to run a sharp Stanley knife around the inside of this, and that will cut a nice, neat, smooth hole exactly the size that I require. So here we go, I have my hole in the pond liner and the tank connector. I'll come through here. Like so. And then the lock nut would clamp over this. Now I'm going to get the liner cleaned up here on both sides where the connection is protruding through, so that the glue is going to form a nice bond as well. But that will end up sitting down here like this, below ground level, with the inlet hose to the cascade attached to the end of the hose tail here and secured with a Jubilee clip. And then that will allow water to enter the cascade here well below ground level in a very easy to control and discreet fashion. So I'm in the process of connecting up the original hose to the tank connector and the new inlet for the Cascade. On the end of the hose tail here, which is the pipe joiner, it's a plastic joiner that inserts, a bit like the end of this hose tail here, that inserts into the hose a liberal amount of PTFE tape and then a Jubilee clip, a hose clip, just to make sure that's nice and secure. And again on this side, some PTFE tape, the length of pipe that will be joining the tank connector to the end of this pipe, and a couple of Jubilee clips on either side as well. And again, obviously I've PTFE'd the connector for good measure. You only want to do this once. Now if you struggle to get the pipe work onto the fittings, and this is quite rigid sort of stuff, it's not particularly pliable or easy to work with, the best thing to use is a heat gun. And just gently warm through the pipe. Don't be too mad because you can really overheat it. So I'll just keep moving the pipe as I'm blowing some warm air over it until it starts to soften up. There we go, so I've heated that up to make both ends just a little bit more pliable. I'll make sure that I put my hose tails into place now. Put that on that end. Just apply a bit more heat to this section. Go, and that just slips over nice and easily like that. Perfect. Now another little tip when securing the Jubilee clips, the hose clips. Generally people would just use a screwdriver, a little flathead screwdriver or a Phillips screwdriver in here, which is always a nightmare. The screwdriver slips, you end up impaling yourself in the hand with the screwdriver, and it's much better to use just a little socket set, a little ratchet set, which you can go over the top of the screw head there, and you can get a lot more torque on that and really tighten it down. Although it helps if you've got a decent Jubilee clip. Bugger. There's a lesson for you. Always check that your hose clip tightens up nice and easily before you fit it all together, because this one was stuck fast and wasn't going anywhere. So we'll just reattach the pipe. There we go. And then using the socket, we can just tighten up these hose clips with a little bit more torque. There's no danger of it slipping and stabbing myself. You don't want to really over tighten these. As soon as you can meet a bit of resistance against the pipe work, just another half a turn or so, just to cinch it all in is all that's required. If you go hell further and too mad, you're really going to squish and distort the pipe work, and potentially damage and break the hose clip as well. There we go. So we've now got a discreetly concealed inlet into the back of the Cascade. That's going to be well below ground level, but with enough lining above water level to make sure that the whole thing doesn't leak. So the Cascade has been completed. The line has had its first cursory cut, and tomorrow when the mortar's dried we can run it and then just do some final tests to make sure that everything is where it should be before trimming and concealing the last of the liner. Now, as they say, the devil is in the detail. There's a few lovely large rocks that have been embedded into the ground, a few places around the lawn over here, and that's lovely because it helps to tie in the lawn and the rest of the garden with the cascade and just create a bit more of a natural feature. The idea is that the stonework has been kind of worn away out of the ground by the flowing water. So we've got another large rock over here which we'd like to bed in the ground just to continue with that theme and tie the whole lot in together. So with this lovely large feature rock here, I want to get this just dug down in the ground so that just the top is exposed. We don't want to have it sticking up too much because it's going to make cutting the grass a bit of an issue, but just by having it dug down with the top exposed, it'll tie the whole lot in together, provide a little bit more interest and not cause a mowing hazard or a problem. And as when positioning rockery stones and building rockeries in the ground, you need to imagine that the stones are a bit like an iceberg and that only really the tip is exposed and sticking out of the ground. So obviously the bulk of this is going to be dug down. Right now I've just positioned the rock in an angle that I'm happy with, and I've been sort of moving around various aspects of the pond and looking at this to make sure I like the angle. And now we're just going to cut out a rough shape in the turf, remove the rock and then dig it out. Well, Dave's going to dig it out. Keep it quiet. Dave thinks that I'm going to take all the credit for doing this. It was hard work watching him, but he dug this, not me. But we've got it in the hole, and I'm pleased with that. So we'll just backfill all around the edges here with a bit more soil. We've got a bit of turf if we need to, but to be honest, just grass seeding around here will be the best thing. And that'll look very nice. Well, we're coming to the end of our journey on this job. This is the final drain down and clean. The pond has been sat filled with water and soaking for the last week or so, so the vast majority of the lime and the muck has already leached out of the cement, and the pond can now be refilled with the reserved original pond water, given a final jet wash. This is a great opportunity to do all the final sort of dressing. There's little offcuts of pond liner or overlaps of liner which were used as the protective layer which need to be trimmed back and concealed. You can see the cascade there has been completed. I'm just doing the finishing touches today with filling the voids at the sides with a bit of cement and then covering it over with soil. It's had a wet test this morning and it was running and looking very nice, if I do say so myself. And as I always say, it's this last day when everything really pulls together and the whole thing becomes a feature. Probably my favourite part, messing around with the plants, getting them put into all the planting zones, adding little pockets of moss and mind your own business and bits and pieces to the rocks and the cascades. So yeah, it's a good moment for me now. So both cascades are up and running. and we've been dressing and concealing the edges, putting some soil and turf and bits and pieces to conceal the liner. And now it's really all coming together. So I've been busy sorting out and dressing some of the marginal plants, some of which were already here in the pond, and I've salvaged most of them. And I've also brought with me a few additions. So I'm going to get in the pond and start to plant up. And I'm rather happy about that, as it's incredibly hot. We are melting, and it'll be quite nice to have an excuse to get into the pond.